how dare you? That one line, spoken in front of the United Nations it was. It was less a speech and more, I don't know, a raw, righteous condemnation.
It really was. And it just instantly crystallized this global youth movement, didn't it?
It defined an era of climate activism right there. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take these complex, sprawling stories, often, fueled by emotion and controversy, and we break them down into digestible, detailed knowledge nuggets just for you.
And today, our mission is dedicated to tracking the evolution of one of the most recognizable and, frankly, polarizing figures of the 21st century, Greta Thunberg. We're going to go beyond the headlines, beyond the sound bites, and use your comprehensive source material as our guide to track her journey.
Exactly. And that journey takes us from, a solitary school striker in Stockholm who is driven by these intensely personal convictions to a figure who achieved unparalleled global youth influence and then eventually broadened years ago far beyond just climate science into the thorny, very complex terrain of human rights and global justice.
It's a huge arc.
It is. We're going to dissect the roots of her conviction, try to understand her uncompromising core philosophy, and then analyze the significant, really undeniable impact she's had globally, whether people celebrate her as a prophet or, vehemently oppose her as a puppet.
So if you are the learner today, you're looking for that thorough, quick knowledge that moves past the superficial coverage. We are here to give you the foundation, the pivotal moments, the specifics of her systemic critiques, and the current highly charged landscape of her activism, all without you feeling overwhelmed. The mission is clear.
Let's unpack this complex narrative. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning, laying the personal groundwork. Greta Tintin Eleonora Erman Thunberg. She was born on January 3rd, 2003 in Stockholm.
Right.
And when you look at her family lineage, it offers this really fascinating contrast to the quiet intensity of her early activism.
It truly does. I mean, she comes from this deeply artistic and very public family. Her mother, Malina Runman, is a celebrated international opera singer.
A huge star.
A huge star. And her father, Svante Thunberg, is an actor. And if you go back another generation, her paternal grandfather, Olaf Thunberg, was also a well-known actor and director.
So this is a family that's really accustomed to the spotlight, to public performance.
Absolutely. Yet Greta found her own, very unique way onto the world stage, and it was rooted not in theater, but in what she saw as deeply felt scientific truth.
And what's so crucial here is recognizing the moment of ignition. The sources say the turning point occurred remarkably early. She was only 8 years old, around 2011, when she first heard about climate change.
And this wasn't just, some idle curiosity. Her reaction was visceral. She was deeply confused, and I think that's the key word here, confused by the widespread inaction from adults, from leaders regarding a threat of this magnitude.
She just couldn't process it.
No, she couldn't comprehend why, if this problem was so real, so existential, people weren't acting like it.
And that confusion, that moral distress, it quickly metastasized into a personal crisis. This is a part of her story that I think often gets overlooked in the sound bites.
For sure.
Around age 11, the sources detail that she struggled severely with depression. This included restricted eating, which led to a dramatic and very visible loss of 10 kilograms in a short period.
And this was a long battle. She spent almost 4 years dealing with this depression before she ever started her strike campaign.
It was a crucible of mental and emotional strain. And it was during this period that she received formal clinical diagnoses: Asperger's syndrome, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD.
And selective mutism. And these conditions, which can often be debilitating for people, really provided the framework for her unique focus.
Which leads us to her famous reframing of her Asperger's diagnosis. She doesn't view it as a limitation, she calls it her superpower.
Yeah, and that phrase is just essential to grasping her ability to cut through the noise.
Why so?
Well, she argues that autistic people often experience a form of, let's call it sensory or emotional honesty. They cannot look away from the truth and feel compelled to tell the truth as they see it without being encumbered by, the social norms and pleasant fictions that allow the rest of us to practice denial or apathy.
So for her, this neurological difference basically stripped away the ability to accept the climate crisis as just, business as usual.
Exactly. It also offers a layer of social commentary. She's noted that many people in the Fridays for Future movement are also autistic. They found a welcoming community and a profound purpose in the rigid, data-driven demands of climate activism.
Right, a place where their particular focus and honesty are assets, not obstacles.
And that intense, data-driven conviction wasn't just focused outward at the world. It began with her family.
Oh, yeah. For nearly 2 years leading up to the strike, she relentlessly pushed her parents to lower the family's carbon footprint.
And we're not talking about a casual suggestion here. I mean, she became the internal, unrelenting environmental auditor of the household.
She used actual graphs, hard data, scientific facts to essentially argue that they were complicit in stealing her future.
And this push wasn't just theoretical. It resulted in significant, radical, and frankly, costly lifestyle changes for the entire family. They transitioned to a vegan diet, they prioritized upcycling and reducing consumption.
And most notably, they gave up flying entirely.
And this point about giving up flying, we should really pause on that because it came at a heavy personal cost. Her mother, Malina Ernman, who was at the height of an international opera career.
She had to essentially abandon that career.
She did, because international travel, which is vital for that profession, became impossible for them.
That's an immense sacrifice. And her father, Svante, later offered this very revealing confession. He admitted they initially agreed to give up flying and make these radical shifts, not primarily to save the climate,
but to save her child.
To save her child. Because they saw the deep emotional stabilization, the happiness, the purpose she derived from taking this uncompromising stand. It really underlines how her activism was born out of profound personal suffering and radical family commitment.
And this foundation of intense conviction and sacrifice led directly to August 2018.
She'd just started 9th grade. On August 20th, 2018, she began her solitary protest outside the Swedish parliament, the Riksdag. She was alone, with a simple hand-painted sign.
It wasn't a spontaneous act. It was deeply considered, and the context just amplified the message. Sweden was simultaneously reeling from its hottest summer in at least 262 years. They were experiencing wildfires, unprecedented heat.
And her core demand was just so simple, so unadorned. The Swedish government must reduce its carbon emissions in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, period.
Interestingly, the idea for the school strike itself wasn't entirely original. The sources clarified that she was directly inspired by U.S. youth activists.
Right, the students who struck after the Parkland school shootings in Florida in February 2018.
Exactly. The idea of using non-attendance or walking out of school as a powerful political tool for young people to assert their influence.
And as so often happens in the modern age, this small, solitary act just exploded through social media.
A simple Instagram photo she posted was shared, and it quickly gained traction. It was amplified heavily by other activists, and there was a key player, a representative of the Finnish bank Nordea.
Right, who quoted one of her initial tweets to hundreds of thousands of followers. That was the moment the spark went global.
But the immediate viral fame came with an instant complication.
The controversy involving the social media company We Don't Have Time, or WDHT, founded by Ingmar Rentzhog.
This is where we see the immediate commercialization of her image begin. Rentzhog, the CEO, used her name and image. Without her express knowledge or permission, it's important to add, to raise millions for a for-profit subsidiary, We Don't Have Time AB.
Wait, so just to be clear, she's out there sitting on the pavement demanding radical non-commercial action. And immediately, almost covertly, her image is being used to raise capital for a private company.
Precisely. That conflict is just inherent to her story. Thunberg, who had volunteered her time as an advisor, received no money from this fundraising. And as soon as she realized the monetization factor, that her genuine activism was being leveraged for profit, she immediately ended her volunteer relationship with them.
It was an early critical lesson in navigating the commercial and political ecosystems that instantly surrounded her image.
Which sets the stage perfectly for her shift from a local phenomenon to a global force.
So following that 2018 Swedish election, she modified her protest strategy. She limited her solitary strikes to just Fridays.
And that subtle shift from a continuous protest to that weekly Friday focus was really the birth of the globally recognized Fridays for Future movement.
And the growth was truly exponential. I mean, by December 2018, just 4 months after her first strike, the movement had exploded.
We saw over 20,000 students striking in at least 270 cities worldwide. It was clear this was resonating so deeply with a generation that was just frustrated by perceived adult failure.
And what's equally significant, especially for those critics who constantly suggest activism is just a distraction, is that the sources confirm her activism did not derail her personal academic responsibilities.
That's a great point. Despite the massive time commitment and the global travel she would soon undertake, she finished her lower secondary school studies with excellent grades, a remarkable 14 A's and 3 B's.
She proved her dedication was focused, not scattered.
And as 2019 began, she transitioned from local hero to an international viral sensation. Her speeches weren't diplomatic. They were sharp, concise, and profoundly unsettling for the established political class.
We saw this first at COP24. That's where she delivered that famous line telling world leaders they were not mature enough to tell it like it is.
But the moment that truly shocked the establishment was at the World Economic Forum in Davos.
Davos, the epicenter of global capitalism and elite power.
And she delivered the "Our house is on fire" quote there. The implication was that the world's financial and political architects, gathered in comfort, were presiding over a disaster that was already consuming the vulnerable. It was direct confrontation.
The political response was instant and fractured. While she addressed the British, European, and French parliaments, which is a massive feat for a teenager, we immediately saw calculated opposition.
Right. Several right-wing politicians in France famously boycotted her appearance, signaling those early political battle lines.
But on the other hand, the moral authority of the movement was acknowledged by Pope Francis. He met her briefly, offered thanks and encouragement for her work.
Her commitment to the cause then led to this extreme logistical challenge that elevated her profile even further. That summer, she took a year-long sabbatical from school.
Her intention was to travel the entire American continent to attend COP25, which was initially scheduled for Chile, all without using any air travel.
So the first transatlantic crossing became a major global news story. She sailed for 15 days from Plymouth, England to New York City on the Militia II, a 60-foot racing yacht.
And the vessel itself was a symbol of her commitment. It was equipped with solar panels and underwater turbines, really emphasizing that carbon-neutral movement.
But this demonstration wasn't without its own controversy, and it really highlights the difficulty of achieving true zero-emission travel. Critics pointed out that the professional crew needed to fly back to Europe to retrieve the yacht,
effectively offsetting the carbon savings of her trip.
Exactly. It sparked a necessary global debate. Is pure carbon neutrality logistically possible today? She argued the symbolic statement was still necessary.
While she was in the U.S., she gave testimony that became really a masterclass in minimalist protest. She appeared before the U.S. House Select Committee on the climate crisis.
And instead of giving a long, emotional speech, she delivered an 8-sentence statement.
And this is a critical detail that needs emphasis for you, the learner. Instead of testifying, she submitted the entire IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees C as her evidence.
Her message was stark. My words are irrelevant. The only testimony required is the objective scientific consensus.
That brings us back to the context of that IPCC report. We talked about it earlier, but let's just pause on the science she was placing on the table. That report, published in 2018, it essentially set a non-negotiable deadline.
Absolutely. The IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius was the ultimate scientific warning. It stated unequivocally that to keep global heating to that relatively safe 1.5 degree threshold, a key target in the Paris Agreement, global net human-caused emissions of CO2 needed to fall by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030.
And reach net zero around 2050.
Right. So when she handed that report over, the subtext was, you are failing this objective scientific mandate, your targets are inadequate, and the clock is ticking on a fixed deadline. It made her silence more devastating than any speech could have been.
That confrontation led directly to the emotional and viral peak of her 2019 activism, the UN Climate Action Summit speech in New York on September 23rd.
Where the infamous "how dare you" moment occurred.
She condemned world leaders for their inaction, accusing them of having stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words.
And her critique wasn't just about emissions, it was systemic. She was attacking the singular focus on money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth above all else. It was a raw articulation of generational betrayal.
That same day, they backed up the rhetoric with legal action. She and 15 other children filed a landmark formal complaint with UNICEF.
And they specifically targeted 5 major polluting nations, Argentina, Brazil, France, Germany, and Turkey, for failing to meet their Paris Agreement emission reduction targets.
This was just a brilliant tactical move. It challenged those nations under the third optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Now, it was non-legally binding. It couldn't force any country to change its laws, but it was a massive symbolic and moral action. It used established international mechanisms to reframe climate inaction as a direct violation of children's rights.
It transformed a scientific problem into a legal and ethical one.
Precisely.
The autumn of 2019 saw the movement peak in terms of just sheer numbers. The global climate strikes on September 20th and 27th drew over 4 million people worldwide.
In Montreal alone, where she attended, it was described as the largest protest in the city's history. This was proof the movement had moved far beyond one solitary figure.
But her travel plans soon hit a snag, which just showed the unpredictability of global events. Capital 25 was abruptly moved from Santiago, Chile to Madrid, Spain.
Right, due to widespread public unrest in Chile. And since she couldn't fly, she was stranded politically on the wrong side of the Atlantic.
So, true to her commitment, she posted on social media that she needed a carbon-neutral ride back across the Atlantic to get to the conference.
Which led to the second, equally publicized transatlantic voyage. She sailed from Hampton, Virginia to Lisbon, Portugal, aboard the catamaran La Vagabond.
And this time she framed the sailing specifically to emphasize the lack of viable infrastructure, saying it was necessary to send a message that there is no real sustainable option to travel across the oceans when you consider the emissions of conventional flight.
And when she finally arrived in Madrid for COP25, she was brutally honest about the movement's achievements.
She was. She stated that despite the global waves of school strikes, they had, in her words, achieved nothing.
Because, critically, global greenhouse gas emissions had continued to rise by 4% since the Paris Agreement in 2015. She demanded more than symbolic protest. She demanded concrete governmental action.
So if we move past the viral moments, past the public persona, we need to understand the intellectual, really uncompromising core of her argument.
Yeah.
What is the Greta Thunberg philosophy demanding of global society?
Well, her core position is rooted in an almost religious adherence to data. She defines the climate crisis as an existential threat to humanity. And she explicitly holds previous and subsequent generations, the policymakers of the last few decades, responsible for allowing this catastrophe to unfold.
And for perpetuating the detrimental changes required to maintain business as usual.
Right. And her approach, it's been defined by political scientists as technocratic ecocentrism.
Okay, that sounds academic, but it's key, you're saying.
It is. It just means her entire framework is grounded on the exaltation of the vox scientifica, the voice of science, above all political, economic, or social considerations.
So that framework dictates her entire strategy. She's consistently telling politicians and the public, do not listen to me, you should listen to what the scientists are saying.
Exactly. Her role is merely to amplify the mandate of climate physics.
And why is framing it this way, as technocratic ecocentrism? Why is that so powerful compared to other climate philosophies? Like radical deep ecology or neoliberal environmentalism that relies on carbon trading.
It's the sheer uncompromising nature of it. Those other philosophies, you can negotiate with them. They operate in the realm of policy trade-offs. Technocratic ecocentrism says the science defines the limit, and politics must unconditionally surrender to that limit.
She removes the moral negotiation.
She does, and the scientific demand she adheres to is absolute, flowing directly from that IPCC report we discussed. She insists that merely lowering emissions is not enough. Emissions must be reduced to zero to keep warming below the critical 1.5 degrees C threshold.
And this is a fundamental point of contention with global policy. She argues that the focus on lowering, say, a 30% or 40% reduction instead of stopping entirely is the greatest force behind the continuing business as usual.
Because if you only lower emissions, you are still adding carbon to the atmosphere. The atmospheric stock continues to rise, just slower. Only reaching net zero stops the stock increase.
That uncompromising stance directly informed her harsh critique of the European Union's climate goals.
Oh, absolutely. She called the EU's 40% reduction target for 2030 totally insufficient, arguing that the true scientific mandate requires an 80% cut by that time.
And when the EU passed the European climate law, she labeled it a surrender.
A surrender. And she didn't stop there. She dismissed the broader European Green Deal as greenwashing.
For her, greenwashing isn't just corporate deception. It's governmental policy that sends a strong signal of sufficient action. A political comfort blanket, if you will, when in fact the policies do not align with the scientific requirement of the 1.5-degree target.
In her view, it's delaying catastrophe under the guise of progress.
And this systemic critique It quickly expanded into a vital global justice lens, directly linking the climate crisis to human rights and geopolitical inequality.
Right. She constantly highlights the disproportionate effect of climate change on the global south. This is a key intellectual shift for the movement.
She emphasizes that these nations contributed least to historical carbon emissions, yet they suffer the most immediate and devastating consequences of climate chaos, often today, not decades from now.
She encapsulated that immense, cruel imbalance in Madrid in 2019 with a truly devastating quote. "We talk about our future, they talk about their present."
That just puts the crisis into two separate timelines, doesn't it?
It does. Furthermore, she became a staunch advocate for making environmental destruction legally actionable at the highest level. She and fellow activists wrote an open letter urging EU leaders to advocate for making ecocide an international crime at the International Criminal Court.
And she applied this principle specifically to the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yes. She specifically called for Russia to be held accountable for ecocide following the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in June 2023, a disaster that caused immense ecological damage to the Black Sea region. This shows her applying her expansive justice framework to real-time geopolitical conflicts.
Given her deep skepticism of inadequate political targets, it's no surprise that her view of the global climate conferences themselves is just utterly scathing.
Yeah. Ahead of COP26, she made that famous prediction that leaders would just engage in blah, 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 and that the conference would yield nothing more than some symbolic things and creative accounting.
She argued that these major international gatherings had become performance art rather than engines for change.
And while she champions democracy as necessary for grassroots change, she hasn't shied away from political confrontation with authoritarian regimes.
That's right. She directly criticized Chinese President Xi Jinping, explicitly stating that democracy is the only solution to the climate crisis.
By directly calling him a leader of a dictatorship, she reinforced her philosophy that the massive public pressure and transparency necessary for radical emissions cuts can only truly flourish where citizens have the power to challenge and vote out inaction.
As we move into 2020, the entire world changed with the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this forced a major strategic pivot for FFF.
Her response to the crisis was to leverage it as a teaching moment. She urged the public to change behavior, stating powerfully, "In a crisis, we change our behavior and adapt to the new circumstances for the greater good of society."
And the movement adapted rapidly, moving the Fridays for Future strikes entirely online.
The sources also reveal she used the pandemic to draw a direct and insightful link between ecological destruction and public health.
How so?
She addressed how habitat destruction, biodiversity loss, and unsustainable food production systems create the perfect conditions for the spillover and spread of zoonotic diseases. Those diseases that jump from animals to humans.
Like COVID-19, but also Zika, Ebola, MERS.
All of them. She underlined that the pandemic shone a light on how we cannot make it without science. The pandemic just reinforced her foundational premise: listen to the experts.
But she didn't soften her criticism of insufficient political action, even in nations that are generally seen as climate forward.
Not at all. She famously criticized the New Zealand Labour government's climate emergency declaration. She labeled it virtue signaling.
Because while it sounded good, the commitment only amounted to reducing less than 1% of the nation's total emissions by 2025.
Exactly. It's that gap between the rhetoric and the numerical reality that consistently draws her ire.
And we see her activism expanding beyond climate policy into explicit geopolitical and social justice issues starting around 2021. This is where that intersectional lens truly takes hold.
The first major global incident was her tweet in support of the Indian farmers' protest in 2021, who were demonstrating against agricultural reform bills.
This was a move away from pure carbon accounting into the complex territory of land rights, economics, and national sovereignty.
And this tweet proved explosive. It really illustrated the immediate political risk of her expansion.
It did. The support led to effigies of her being burned by Hindutva nationalists in Delhi. And crucially, her initial tweet included a link to a campaigning toolkit document.
Essentially a guide on how to organize support. She quickly deleted it, calling it outdated, and replaced it with a different one.
But the damage was done. That initial toolkit controversy led to the arrest of the Indian climate activist who allegedly edited the document, Disha Ravi, on serious charges of sedition and criminal conspiracy.
This incident just highlighted the political landmines awaiting any climate activist who ventures into the specific, localized politics of major world powers. For FFF, A statement of solidarity intended to support social justice immediately triggered accusations of foreign interference and resulted in an arrest under deeply serious charges.
She also engaged heavily in indigenous rights issues, consistently arguing that traditional land rights must trump corporate profit.
A key example was her condemnation of the British firm Beowulf for planning to mine iron on Sami land in Sweden. She argued explicitly that indigenous rights must be prioritized above the short-term profit of a company seeking to extract resources. For her, climate justice means social and racial justice.
And as major geopolitical conflict erupted with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, she combined her environmental focus with human rights. She was frequently seen combining her Friday climate protests with demonstrations outside the Russian embassy in Stockholm,
Holding a sign that read, "Stand with Ukraine." This culminated in her meeting with President Zelensky in Ukraine in June 2023, specifically to discuss the massive ecological damage caused by the war again, uniting climate, human rights, and military conflict under the umbrella of ecocide.
In June 2023, she reached a personal milestone, high school graduation. This officially marked the end of the school's strike phase, which had defined her public image for 5 years.
But she immediately vowed that her fight has only just begun, and she later began a bachelor's program at Stockholm University.
Post-graduation, we see a palpable shift. She moved from symbolic strikes to embracing overt civil disobedience,
Which instantly led to multiple legal challenges. She was charged and fined multiple times in Malmö, Sweden, for obstructing police orders after blocking access to oil tankers, a crucial piece of fossil fuel infrastructure.
And her defense in these courtrooms was fascinating because it reflected her core philosophical defense.
Precisely. She argued that her actions were not mere lawbreaking, but a necessary form of self-defense due to the existential threat posed by the fossil fuel industry itself.
So, in effect, she was arguing that stopping infrastructure that causes catastrophic harm should be viewed as legally justifiable.
A powerful moral argument. Despite that, she was found guilty and received recurring fines.
The legal scrutiny extended beyond Sweden. In October 2023, she was arrested in London during protests targeting the Energy Intelligence Forum, often called the Oscars of oil.
And this case is important because of its outcome. It was ultimately dismissed in early 2024 because the prosecution failed to present sufficient evidence. But the pattern was established. The post-strike Greta Thunberg would risk arrest and engage the legal system directly.
In terms of her documented work, 2022 saw the release of the Climate Book, which served as a major intellectual consolidation of her position.
This was a massive undertaking and a clear statement about her technocratic ecocentrism. She not only authored parts of the book, but served as the curator, compiling essays and perspectives from over 100 experts, geophysicists, economists, historians, indigenous leaders.
So the book really reinforced her mission.
Yeah.
She's a megaphone for experts.
Absolutely. And she ensured that she would not personally profit from this global platform, donating all copyright and royalties to her own foundation, maintaining her financial commitment to nonprofit activism.
And now we arrive at the most significant and, without a doubt, the most controversial evolution of her activism: the explicit integration of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and global human rights issues, particularly concerning the Gaza war starting in late 2023.
This transition was where the intersectionality of her stated philosophy became unavoidable. And she provided the intellectual justification herself, stating, "For me, it hasn't been solely about the climate at all. All forms of justice are included within climate justice."
So by making climate justice inherently about human rights, she formally expanded her focus into areas that are, politically toxic for global movements.
And that expansion hit the headlines on October 20th, 2023. She posted a photo from a Friday strike showing protesters holding signs. 3 signs explicitly supported Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, alongside one demanding climate justice now.
The reaction was immediate and fierce. She was widely criticized for posting support for Palestine without having immediately and explicitly condemned the horrific October 7th attacks by Hamas, which had occurred just 2 weeks earlier.
So what was her subsequent response to this intense backlash?
Well, she responded the following day, clarifying that she was against the horrific attacks by Hamas, but the political damage had been done, particularly in Israel.
Right. The Israeli Ministry of Education acted swiftly. They removed references to Thunberg as a role model and source of inspiration from its official curriculum in direct response to her initial statements supporting Gaza.
That shows the immediate, concrete cost of her politicization.
It does. And the polarization continued to deepen within the FFF movement itself. In December 2023, the FFF Sweden chapter published an opinion piece in The Guardian that solidified this new stance.
They affirmed that there is no climate justice without human rights. They argued that the movement has always been political and must speak up when people suffer, are forced to flee, or are killed, regardless of the cause.
They were doubling down on the intersectional approach, even if it meant alienating groups who previously supported them purely on climate grounds.
However, this expanded focus drew specific, volatile, and politically charged controversies that were far more aggressive than her earlier climate clashes.
Oh, yeah. The sources detail particularly severe incidents, especially concerning Germany, which maintains a strong policy of support for Israel. In December 2024, at a pro-Palestine rally in Mannheim, Germany, she was quoted uttering a highly criticized statement: "Fuck Germany and fuck Israel."
That led to local politicians like the CDU's Manuel Hagel publicly accusing her of moving very consciously in close proximity to anti-Semitism.
And the labeling was intense. She had previously been labeled Anti-Semite of the Week in September 2024 by the advocacy group Stop Anti-Semitism, following arrests at pro-Palestinian protests in Copenhagen and Stockholm. This period marked a peak in the personal intensity of the criticism leveled against her.
This political commitment then escalated into direct physical action in 2025, specifically involving efforts to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza and challenge the Israeli total blockade that began in October 2023.
Right. She joined the June 2025 Gaza Freedom Flotilla aboard the UK-flagged vessel Madeleine. This was a symbolic, high-profile challenge.
The vessel, which carried a symbolic amount of aid, was intercepted by the Israel Defense Forces in international waters. Thunberg was detained and subsequently deported from Israel the next day.
This move confirmed her willingness to move from protest signs to direct civil intervention and the subsequent legal risk.
But she didn't view this as a setback. Following her deportation, she joined the larger effort, the Global Sumud Flotilla.
The Global Sumud Flotilla was a far more significant operation, sailing from Barcelona. This follow-up effort saw a total of 45 vessels seized and a massive 462 activists detained between August and October 2025. It marked the largest civilian attempt yet to break the siege.
Following her deportation from the Sumud Flotilla, serious allegations surfaced regarding the treatment of the detainees, including claims from Thunberg herself.
Several released activists, including Thunberg, claimed they were subjected to mistreatment and even alleged torture during their detention. The accusations were grave claims of being beaten, being paraded while draped in an Israeli flag for humiliating photos, and being held in bedbug-infested conditions with insufficient supplies.
And Israel repeatedly and vehemently denied these allegations.
It's absolutely necessary, however, to provide a crucial factual counterpoint noted in the sources. According to Israeli detention court records available in the public domain, Thunberg herself made no personal complaint of mistreatment during her brief detention period before deportation. The source material demands we include that balance.
Right. And this intense period concluded with one final, very sensitive controversy. The day after her deportation, she posted to Instagram, criticizing the mistreatment of Palestinian inmates in Israeli prisons.
But the image she used was tragically and mistakenly that of an emaciated Israeli hostage held by Hamas, Eviatar David. She was implying he was a Palestinian prisoner suffering abuse.
The victim's family immediately and publicly condemned her for the misleading use of their son's image, calling it a gross act of political manipulation. It was a massive media misstep that further complicated her credibility with the public.
Finally, in late 2024, she solidified her political stance on human rights versus climate conferences by boycotting COP T29, which was held in Azerbaijan.
She cited the host country's autocratic regime, noting its human rights violations and specifically the ethnic cleansing of Armenians.
So instead of attending the high-profile conference, she chose to visit neighboring Armenia and Georgia to support democracy and human rights activists. She stated the conference would yield only loopholes, more negotiations, and symbolic decisions that look good on paper but are really just greenwashing.
She has firmly established that she will prioritize geopolitical justice over symbolic conference attendance. So, looking back across this entire arc, the sheer magnitude of the public response she triggered is remarkable. Her youth, her intensity, her uncompromising message, it generated incredible political praise and just as intense opposition.
It was impossible to ignore her.
Impossible. On the side of support, we saw high-level acknowledgement that she was filling a moral vacuum. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres repeatedly endorsed the strikes.
He admitted his own generation had failed and acknowledged the youth's righteous anger. Even German Chancellor Angela Merkel, one of Europe's most powerful leaders, publicly credited activists like Thunberg with driving her government to act faster on climate change.
But the mockery was constant, high profile, and often deeply personal. Former U.S. President Donald Trump repeatedly criticized her. After her emotional UN speech, he tweeted that she seemed like a very happy young girl looking forward to a bright and wonderful future. So nice to see.
And then later, after she was named Time Person of the Year 2019, he suggested she should work on her anger management problem, then go to a good old-fashioned movie with a friend. Chill, Greta. Chill.
And this is where her media genius really shone through. She didn't just ignore these insults, she weaponized them.
She would skillfully use these attacks as immediate ammunition by updating her Twitter biography to match the criticism.
Right. She changed it to match Trump's insult, calling herself a teenager working on her anger management problem, currently chilling and watching a good old-fashioned movie with a friend. Why was that tactic so effective?
It was brilliant because it didn't just neutralize the critic. It exposed the ad hominem nature of the attack itself. She took their personal insult and wore it as a badge, immediately forcing the conversation back to the climate science, which they were trying to distract from.
She used the same tactic when Russian President Vladimir Putin called her a kind girl and very sincere, but poorly informed.
And after Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro called her a brat, or parala in Portuguese, which she also adopted for her bio, she demonstrated a really sophisticated understanding of media dynamics.
Despite her skill at flipping the script, the opposition often relied purely on personal, deeply unpleasant attacks.
The sources detail consistent and ugly personal attacks that often mocked her Asperger's diagnosis. Specific media figures, largely from the populist right, engaged in mocking her emotional delivery and her appearance.
And we even saw the extreme example of a Canadian energy company, Excite Energy Services, distributing a truly disturbing sticker. It depicted violence against a girl labeled Greta.
The company later apologized for distributing it following public outrage, but the hostility was often just so disproportionate to her actions.
But despite the toxicity of the backlash, the overall impact, what many commentators call the Greta effect, is profoundly measurable and undeniable.
Absolutely. The effect isn't just symbolic. It's quantifiable in behavior, in finance, and in politics. For instance, a YouGov poll in the UK in 2019 showed a dramatic surge in public concern about the environment, directly correlating with the rise of the FFF movement.
We also saw a boom in the publication and sales of children's environmental books. That clearly shows her influence filtering down to the youngest consumers.
And there was a notable global increase in Google searches for terms like climate crisis.
And crucially, this youth activism translated into genuine political shifts. The 2019 European Parliament elections saw Green parties record their best ever results.
That election boosted Green MEP seats from 52 to 72, particularly in Northern Europe, where the strikes were most visible and active. This suggests that the youth activism she spearheaded was directly contributing to voting behavior and political outcomes.
And on the financial side, she inspired wealthy philanthropists to put money directly into the movement.
Yeah, philanthropists donated substantial sums, including $600,000 to the Climate Emergency Fund, inspired by her organizing power. The goal was to raise even hundreds of millions more, recognizing that her efforts had created this decentralized, powerful vehicle for demanding change.
And perhaps her most famous cultural and behavioral impact is flight scam.
Flight shame.
Flight shame.
Flight scam is the direct social pressure not to fly due to airline emissions, and it gained significant momentum due to Thunberg's very public and persistent refusal to use air travel.
And this wasn't just a cultural meme. It translated into measurable behavioral change in her home country. What does the data say?
Well, in Sweden specifically, there was a reported 4% drop in domestic air travel in 2019, alongside an 8% rise in rail use, according to data from SJ, the Swedish state railways.
That is a rare and powerful example of an activist's personal choice directly influencing a nation's transportation habits.
It really is.
Finally, we have to mention her undeniable legacy in the halls of culture, and perhaps most permanently, in science. She was Time's Person of the Year in 2019, the youngest ever recipient, and has received numerous human rights accolades like Amnesty International's Ambassador of Conscience Award.
Culturally, her image is global. She's been immortalized in massive murals in San Francisco and Bristol. She's been the subject of documentaries like I Am Greta, and her powerful speeches have been sampled into music by major artists like the 1975 and Fatboy Slim.
But the scientific honors are something else entirely. I mean, we have a beetle, a land snail and a Panamanian frog named after her. That's not just a mural or a documentary. That's a literal permanent place in the scientific canon.
It is a phenomenal tribute. Scientists have named several new species in her honor, directly demonstrating how her work has elevated the status of science and environmental protection. There's the beetle Nulliptodes gradae, the land snail Craspidotropis Greta Thunberg, and the Panamanian frog Pristamontis Greta Thunberg. She truly is a living monument to the power of scientific awareness and the ecological imperative. Hashtag tag chat outro.
So if we synthesize this entire narrative, what we have seen is a profound arc. She began as a solitary striker, driven by a deeply held, Asperger-informed conviction to only speak the science. She achieved unparalleled global influence among youth, which exposed her to intense political and personal backlash. And this exposure ultimately pushed her to evolve into a broader, intersectional human rights activist who views environmental devastation as inextricably linked to social suffering.
Her journey confirms her unyielding demand for action aligned precisely with climate physics, and her later philosophy that true climate justice cannot exist without global human rights. Her willingness to risk fines and detention, whether she was blocking oil tankers in Sweden or joining aid flotillas in the Mediterranean, demonstrates her ultimate conviction that massive public pressure and civil disobedience are essential today.
Because, as she put it simply, nature doesn't bargain.
Nature doesn't bargain.
Which brings us to a final, provocative question for you to consider. If, as Thunberg explicitly stated, all forms of justice are included within climate justice, how must global environmental movements now navigate the intense political complexity of wars and human rights conflicts, such as the one she became embroiled in, to successfully achieve their foundational scientific goals?
It's a challenge that will define the political future of environmental action.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.